Our course is the right one, and we're not going to change it just because the wind is blowing.
I will not concede anything to those who want destruction and disorder. I take my share of responsibility.
I'm your host, Behruz Najafi. Welcome to the show. Well, this is the 10th consecutive Yellow Vest protest rally held in France in protest against the economic issues and also the state of democracy in that country. Protesters have defied a national debate proposed by President Emmanuel Macron, who is trying to calm down the situation. 5,000 security forces were deployed to the capital, Paris. They used violent tactics against protesters again, including shooting rubber bullets and using water cannon. Will protesters take heed of the president's call for national dialogue? Where will the protests lead to? To start, let's watch a report.
Yellow Vest protesters are out again. It's the 10th consecutive weekend of anti-government protests in France, and people take to the streets across the country despite President Emmanuel Macron's call for a national debate aimed at stemming Yellow Vest protesters' simmering anger. Armored vehicles and nearly 5,000 police forces have been deployed to the streets to contain the protests. Like previous weeks, security forces resorted to tear gas and batons to disperse the crowd. Several were injured and many were arrested. Volunteer medics say some of the injuries look like war wounds.
I've said it before, these are war wounds. I need strong equipment, bandages, compressors. I'm not here just applying saline solution. I pick up people off the floor.
The rallies started in mid-November as a simple protest against planned fuel hikes, but soon morphed into mass demonstrations against Macron and his policies. Some of the protesters say they're on the streets because they have financial problems.
Let's just say that we demand first better purchasing power for low-paid workers and aid to the small pensioners.
Some others believe that the least the government can do is to acknowledge their difficulties.
I expect absolutely nothing from the government, but at the least they should listen to us and they stop hitting at the population and stop dividing the population like they are doing now.
At first, Macron refused to give in to the protesters' demand. But in mid-December, he was forced to scrap the planned fuel tax rises after protesters didn't die down. Later, he even promised extra cash for minimum wage earners and tax cuts for pensioners. But the demonstrators say Macron's concessions are not enough as he can't relate to their financial difficulties. Many of them are calling for his resignation. Macron insists that his planned debate can solve many problems, but many Yellow Vest protesters say they will boycott the talks. It seems that they want a radical policy shift in favor of the low earners. However, their unwillingness to communicate makes it difficult for the government to quell the anger that continues to boil across France.
First tensions here in Paris today as Act 10 is underway of the Gilets Jaunes. Over in the distance, you might be able to see the water cannon. They're trying to disperse the protesters away from this area. We did see protesters actually trying to break down some of the traffic lights, and we've also seen tear gas being dispersed. It looks like there's some people down on the ground a little bit further over there by a tree. It looks like they potentially could have been injured. And as you can see, the protesters are trying to throw back the tear gas pellets now towards the police. Official figures from the Interior Ministry say around 7,000 people are out in Paris today taking part in this 10th weekend of protests. According to those figures, across France, it's 27,000 individuals. That is far lower than the figures we saw just a week ago when there were more than 80,000 people out across France. But the Gilets Jaunes have often disputed those figures from the Ministry of the Interior. Well, as we can see, there is anger out in the streets now. Let's take a look back now at that anger that's been bubbling over since November 17th. As you can see, some damage to a vehicle there. Protesters trying to throw projectiles towards the police. Somebody there being dragged away. Looks like they've received an injury as a result of something that's been hit. And there you can see just chaos ensuing as they're trying to get somebody injured out of this crowd. For the moment, there's also been lots of violence against journalists in these protests, and there was actually a protest underway today against that violence. I can just hear behind us something sounding like it's being smashed up. I mean, really has just gone from total calm into chaos in just a matter of moments. This protest was meant to be in tribute to the people who have died in these protests since they began and also been injured in these protests. And it looks like there could be even more injuries today.
Demonstrations by so-called Yellow Vest protesters in Paris turned to riots as those taking part demanded that French President Emmanuel Macron should resign. Police used tear gas and water cannon as demonstrators became violent. Police also tackled them with batons and controversial flashball guns. Crowds calling for Macron to step down also carried coffin-shaped items to represent the 10 people who've died in the protests. There were 30 arrests in Paris, many suspected of carrying offensive weapons. Similar demonstrations took place in other French cities and towns, and more than 50,000 police and gendarmes were deployed. Those fuel taxes have been scrapped, but the campaign has now become an anti-Macron protest.